The Mahogany Steakhouse felt safe. A low-key finance executive, really the most wanted criminal syndicate head in the country, enjoyed his solitude. Years of careful deception rested on this fragile undercover life. He ordered the rare filet, watching the room, accustomed to analyzing threats that never materialized. Tonight was different. The veteran server, delivering the bread service, barely shifted her gaze. She slid a napkin across the table, one folded square of paper. Inside, 4 stark words proving everything was finished. The polished luxury was now a gilded cage. The executive persona evaporated, replaced instantly by the ruthless architect of the underworld. The hunters were here. He just had to find them first. The mahogany of the Corinthian room absorbed the low light, reflecting it back in dull, opulent pools. The ambient chatter, the clinking of crystal, the soft, confident hum of power brokers discussing quarterly returns provided a perfect sonic blanket. It was October 14th, 2023, and to any observer, the man seated alone at the corner booth was simply Vincent Vince Maxwell, 48, a successful low-key finance executive. His tailored suit was impeccable, his movements controlled, betraying nothing of the lethal architecture hidden beneath the veneer of corporate anonymity he had painstakingly constructed since early 2018. Vince didn't just maintain an aggressive calm, he embodied it. His dark eyes, usually reserved for scanning market fluctuations, conducted a quiet, routine sweep of the restaurant perimeter. Years of unchallenged authority had honed his senses into instruments of precision. Tonight, he was anticipating only a perfectly seared ribeye, a momentary respite in his self-imposed absolute solitude. A server approached, her posture suggesting a weary professionalism born of a decade spent navigating demanding clientele. This was Chloe Davis, 35, mid-height, her observant eyes quickly cataloguing the table's needs before she even reached it. She was pragmatic, efficient, and, Vince noted unconsciously, held herself with a quiet dignity. "Good evening, Mr. Maxwell," Chloe said, her voice low enough not to disturb the neighboring conversations, yet clear enough to be heard over the background noise. She placed a warmed basket of artisanal bread on the table, her hand momentarily shielding the motion. As her hand withdrew, it performed an almost imperceptible action. A folded linen napkin, crisper and whiter than the one already beside his silverware, slid silently across the dark wood, stopping precisely at the edge of his water glass. The placement was too deliberate, too specific to be accidental. Vince's internal clock stopped. His heart rate did not accelerate, but his perception of time stretched, making the ordinary sound of ice melting in his drink seem deafening. He didn't react with a flinch or a widening of the eye. Instead, he reached for the new napkin with the practiced indifference of a man simply adjusting his place setting. Chloe had already moved away, attending to a couple across the room, her expression utterly neutral. Under the table, sheltered from the light and any peripheral glance, Vince unfolded the napkin. The fabric was stiff. Inside, scrawled in hurried, stark handwriting, was the terrifying message, "They're here to kill you." The words were an instantaneous detonation, obliterating the 5 years of meticulous cover he had woven. The quiet luxury of the Corinthian room instantly dissolved, replaced by the suffocating feeling of a gilded cage. Vince Maxwell, the successful executive, vanished. In his place sat the cold, calculating head of the Maxwell syndicate. His immediate priority was not panic, but calibration. He needed data, and he needed it now. Vince took a deliberate sip of his water, allowing his eyes to sweep the room again, but this time the sweep wasn't casual. It was diagnostic. He wasn't looking for waitstaff or clientele anymore. He was searching for anomalies. The entire geometry of the room had changed, morphing from a relaxing environment into a 3-dimensional threat matrix. The kitchen, too close. A common staging area for a rapid extraction or poisoning attempt. The entrance, dominated by a large, ornate marble podium, too exposed. The fire exit, discreetly tucked behind a partition near the restrooms. A possibility, but risky. He focused on the people. The room was perhaps half full. 3 distinct groups immediately flagged his attention, not by their demeanor, but by their lack of one. They were too still, too isolated, too focused on their meals in a place where most diners were focused on their phones or their companions. 1. The couple by the window. A standard business pairing, middle-aged, seemingly engaged in a low-stakes discussion about real estate. Except the man, clean-cut with an almost invisible earpiece, hadn't touched his food in 10 minutes. His gaze occasionally drifted past Vince's shoulder, a classic triangulation setup. 2. The solo diner at the bar, reading a newspaper, an antique affectation in 2023. Too cliché. His posture was wrong. Too much muscle tension in the shoulders, too ready to spring from the stool. 3. The buses near the service station. 2 young men, efficient, but moving with a subtle, non-rhythmic coordination. One had a slightly bulging jacket pocket, the wrong shape for a cell phone, the perfect shape for a silenced semi-automatic. 3 distinct teams. That was overkill for a simple hit. That suggested preparation, coordination, and a deeply entrenched source of intelligence on his movements. Rival family. The Morettis had been quiet since the disastrous port seizure 6 months ago. The Irish contingent rarely operated this far south, or this cleanly. The only logical answer pointed inward. A deeply embedded traitor. A rat seeking to create a power vacuum, knowing Vince's elimination would throw the entire empire into chaos. Vince reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't retrieve a conventional weapon. He retrieved his Mont Blanc Meisterstuck pen, an innocuous tool of his finance executive cover. It was sleek, black, and heavy. He held it casually, turning it over between his fingers, as if contemplating signing a 9-figure deal. Only Vince knew that a precisely calibrated twist of the cap released a 2-inch needle-sharp micro-blade designed for emergency close-quarters defense. It was silent, effective, and looked like office supplies until the moment of application. His gaze settled on the window couple, then drifted back toward the service station. They were waiting for a signal, or for him to make a move that would confirm the warning was accurate. He couldn't wait for his stake. The moment he tried to leave the booth, the trap would spring. His cover was irrevocably blown. The necessity now was not discretion, but decisive action. Vince needed to establish the source of the leak, and quickly, before the immediate problem consumed him. He thought of Arthur Jensen, 52. Jensen, with his clean-cut appearance and prematurely graying temples, had been Vince's consigliere for the past 7 years, appearing affable and fiercely loyal. But Vince knew loyalty was a currency often devalued by ambition. Jensen had always exhibited a perpetually tense jaw, a sign Vince had often dismissed as stress, but now recognized as deeply seated resentment. Jensen was calculating, patient, and had intimate knowledge of Vince's routine, including this isolated routine Tuesday dinner. The thought of Jensen triggered a cold, white rage. Not the emotional outburst of a civilian, but the surgical fury of a man whose trust had been violated. If Jensen was responsible, this wasn't just a hit, it was an attempted coup. Vince returned his attention to Chloe, who was now clearing glasses near the bar. He made eye contact, a quick, hard flash that demanded attention. He subtly tapped the folded napkin once, then tapped his wrist, indicating speed. Chloe, possessing a quiet moral courage and high perceptiveness that Vince now relied upon entirely, understood. She gave a minimal nod, barely shifting her tired eyes. She was a risk-taker, clearly, but why was she risking everything for him? That question had to wait. Survival came first. The buses at the service station were getting twitchy. The tension in the room, invisible to the average diner, was vibrating in Vince's skull. They knew he was alerted. The note had been delivered too closely to the moment of execution. Vince reached for the breadbasket. He broke a piece, a calculated, slow motion. As he chewed, he analyzed the logistics. The 2 buses were closest, approximately 12 feet away. The bar diner was at 40 feet. The window couple, 60 feet. The immediate threat was the pair of operatives near the service station. They had the fastest access to him. He calculated the trajectory of the bus's movement, the ambient noise level, and the time required for the bar diner to cross the floor and engage. He had maybe 3 seconds before the initial shots would ring out, even with suppressors. He needed to create a distraction, a brief moment of chaos, not just to move, but to isolate the nearest targets. Vince picked up his glass of water, held it high, and then, with deliberate, practiced ease, he simply dropped it onto the thick carpet. It shattered loudly enough to cause 3 tables to turn their heads, but the carpet muffled the sound just enough to avoid mass panic. It was enough. The 2 buses, trained to react to sudden noise or spills, immediately glanced toward the noise. Their focus broke, if only for a half second. That was all Vince needed. He didn't stand up. He uncoiled. He moved low, sweeping his hand across the table, knocking the silverware and bread plates onto the floor with a clatter, further covering the sound of his exit from the booth. He was already in motion before the shattered water glass had settled. He darted toward the service station, utilizing the row of high-backed chairs as cover. His suit, usually a hindrance, now streamlined his movements. The bussers, realizing their mistake, snapped their heads back. The one with the bulge in his jacket started to reach inside. Vince was faster. He lunged past the service station, grabbing a heavy porcelain serving pitcher filled with gravy waiting to be delivered. The move was pure instinct, brutal economy of motion. He didn't swing, he thrust. The bussers, taken completely by surprise by the sheer speed and the unorthodox weapon, had no time to aim. The first busser caught the pitcher directly in the temple. The sound was a dull, sickening crack, immediately followed by the wet splatter of gravy and bone. The operative collapsed, silent and instantaneous. The second busser fumbled with the pistol, pulling the suppressed weapon free, aiming for Vince's center mass. Vince was already pivoting. He had the Mont Blanc Meisterstock pen tight in his grip. He twisted the cap, releasing the microblade. He drove his elbow hard into the man's sternum, shoving him back against the wooden service column. The collision knocked the air from the operative's lungs, throwing his aim wide. Before the man could recover, Vince drove the microblade deep into the operative's carotid artery, just below the jawline. It was silent, precise, and immediately fatal. Vince twisted the pen, withdrew the blade, and resheathed it in one seamless, horrifying motion. The entire exchange took less than 4 seconds. He was standing over 2 dead men, covered in a mix of gravy, blood, and the lingering scent of expensive cologne, yet somehow appearing only mildly disheveled. The brief clatter and the dropped pitcher had been interpreted by most diners as a clumsy server. Only the professional targets understood what had just occurred. The bar diner was now off his stool, eyes wide with sudden urgency, reaching into his jacket. The window couple began to rise, their smooth conversation replaced by the metallic scrape of chairs on the polished floor. Vince didn't engage them directly. His tactical priority shifted: eliminate pursuit and secure the exit path. He spotted the fire alarm pull station, located near the restrooms, a perfect spot to unleash pandemonium. He grabbed a heavy, industrial-sized serving tray used for clearing plates, solid stainless steel. Using the residual momentum from his last kill, he hurled the tray with maximum force toward the bar diner. The tray spun like a metallic disc, impacting the bar diner squarely in the face. The man dropped instantly, stunned, his pistol skittering uselessly across the marble floor. Simultaneously, Vince sprinted past the service station, heading directly for the restrooms. He ignored the gasps of the few nearby patrons, finally realizing something horrific was unfolding. The window couple had the longest distance to cover. They were trained assassins, but they were also hampered by the proximity of civilian tables. As Vince reached the fire alarm, he looked back. The female operative from the window couple had drawn a small, suppressed sidearm. She was calculating her shot through the maze of tables. Instantaneous chaos. Diners screamed, standing up, knocking over wine bottles, stampeding for the main entrance. The sudden noise and darkness provided the perfect cover. Vince didn't join the stampede. He ducked into the service hallway leading to the kitchen, vanishing into the thick steam and frantic shouts of the kitchen staff. He needed to move outside the restaurant's surveillance grid. The kitchen exit was poorly monitored, a strategic blind spot he had noted months ago. He found Chloe waiting by the back door, holding a heavy trash bag, her face pale but resolute. "The alley," she hissed, pulling the door open. "No cameras for 50 feet, then turn left toward the loading docks." "Why?" Vince asked, his voice low and dangerous, even amidst the alarm. He didn't ask how she knew. He asked why she risked it. "Jensen paid me to monitor you," Chloe admitted, her breath catching. "Standard security detail," he said, "but the signal he gave tonight wasn't a standard alert. It was a kill order. I saw the faces of the men he placed. They weren't security. They were hunters." Vince's internal analysis was confirmed. Arthur Jensen, the supposed loyal consigliere, the treachery cut deeper than he imagined. "You saved my life, Chloe," Vince stated, his penetrating dark eyes boring into hers. "Go. They'll be on the main street." Vince didn't waste time on thanks. He pushed out into the cold October night. The alley reeked of grease and refuse. The screeching alarm was now muffled, echoing the violence he had left behind. He ran, his expensive shoes slapping against the wet asphalt. 50 feet, then the left turn onto a dimmer street running parallel to the river. He knew the city grid intimately. His immediate objective was not his heavily monitored penthouse residence, but the riverfront docks Section 12, a sprawling, isolated industrial hub used for illicit cargo and emergency staging. It was where his loyal security detail, his true muscle, would be waiting if he triggered the Black Sat emergency protocol. As he ran, his hand went to his back pocket, retrieving the burner cell phone black satellite model. It was untraceable, a lifeline. He keyed in the preset emergency code, a 3-digit sequence that would alert his most trusted captains, Marcus in the North Ward, and Silas controlling logistics. The message was simple, brutal, and encoded. The vulture flies. Initiate cleanup. Target, Jensen. He could hear the distant wail of police sirens converging on the Corinthian room. The local precinct was compromised, but even Vince couldn't stop the immediate response to a fire alarm, and reported gunfire, assuming the surviving operatives were now panicking. Vince ducked between 2 large refrigerated trucks, stopping only long enough to confirm the call went through. The phone confirmed the transmission. The retaliation protocols were now live. He felt the familiar, invigorating chill of the hunt. The finance executive was gone, replaced entirely by the ruthless strategist. This wasn't merely survival, it was the preemptive dismantling of a political enemy. When he reached the riverfront docks, the air was sharp with the smell of salt and diesel fuel. Section 12 was a desolate stretch of abandoned warehouses. Exposed and isolated, it offered perfect visibility and control. Boss, Silas acknowledged, his eyes immediately assessing Vince's condition. Tailored suit, microblade residue on his wrist, a controlled fury burning in his eyes. The Corinthian room is scorched. Jensen made his play, Vince stated, stepping into the shadow of the container, putting distance between himself and the streetlights. We have confirmation, Silas confirmed, pulling up an encrypted tablet. Jensen's private transport was tracked, leaving the city limits 10 minutes ago, heading south. Cowardly bastard didn't even stay to watch the result. He thought I was dead before the bread service arrived, Vince sneered, wiping a smear of dark grease from his jacket cuff. He underestimated everything. Vince looked toward the dark, turbulent water of the river. The immediate danger was neutralized, the path forward clear. The successful escape from the restaurant was not the end of the conflict, but the violent opening chapter of his ruthless response. The Maxwell Tower penthouse is secure, boss. We swept it the moment the alert came through. Jensen didn't compromise the core structure, Silas reported. Vince shook his head. We don't go back to the tower yet. It's predictable. Set up a temporary command center in the old shipyard office, 3 blocks from here. I need satellite uplink and 5 men I trust explicitly, armed and ready. He deactivated the burner phone, tossing it onto the concrete where it would be crushed later. He felt a deep, chilling certainty settle over him. His life had been defined by the perfection of his disguise, a perfect shell of 5 years. Now that shell was cracked, and the venomous core of his power was exposed. Silas, Vince commanded, his voice hardening into the tone of absolute finality. I want a clean end to this. Jensen dies before morning, and every single person he spoke to, every asset he used, every loose end, they all disappear. This organization will be purified tonight. I want the message clear. You shoot at the king, you better not miss. The survival of the Maxwell enterprise was assured, not by defense, but by an immediate, brutal counterattack. Vince Maxwell had turned the hunters into the hunted. The crisis was over. The purge had begun. The night air along the docks was corrosive, a mix of brine, industry, and the subtle, coppery scent of the violence Vince had just left behind in the Corinthian room. The adrenaline, which had surged and peaked during the silent execution of the buses, was now receding, leaving behind a glacial calm. He stood in the shadow of the container, watching Silas, who carried the weight of the organization's immediate survival in his eyes. Vince didn't need to repeat the gravity of the situation. Silas understood. In their world, betrayal at the consigliere level was an extinction-level event. Jensen's movement south, Vince began, pushing past the immediate tactical success and focusing solely on the strategic long game. Which route? Air or road? Silas quickly navigated the encrypted tablet. the screen dimly illuminating the taut lines of his face. "Road first, boss. Private car, heavily armored, using pre-vetted escape tunnels beneath the rail yards. He calculated that we wouldn't have enough time to block that egress point. We lost the direct signal 20 miles out, but Marcus has assets positioned further downstate. They are waiting for the transfer. Transfer to what? A high-speed yacht registered offshore, departing from a private marina near Southport by 0400 hours. If he reaches international waters, he disappears." Silas' voice was clipped, professional, devoid of emotion, matching Vince's own. "The shipyard office," Vince instructed. "Now. I need the full topological map of that escape route displayed and direct satellite access to Southport surveillance feeds. Bring the 5. Nobody speaks unless I ask them a question." Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the opulence of the steakhouse. Fluorescent lights flickered over concrete floors. 3 men already assembled stood at attention, armed with military precision. They were the 5, the absolute core, men whose loyalty had been sealed over decades of shared risk and reward. The other 2 entered shortly after, having been pulled from their primary security posts. Vince surveyed the room, 5 silent, lethal extensions of his will. He removed his tailored jacket, now soiled with faint residue of blood and gravy, and tossed it over a broken chair. The meticulous finance executive was fully shed. He walked to the main table, upon which Silas quickly projected the detailed, multi-layered route map. The map showed Arthur's anticipated trajectory, a winding path designed to bypass all conventional checkpoints, leading inexorably toward the coast. "Arthur's weakness was always confidence," Vince murmured, his dark eyes tracing the digital lines. "He believed he was untraceable. He believed I was complacent." Vince turned to Silas. "Did Arthur communicate with anyone internal in the last 48 hours, outside of standard business communications? We are analyzing encrypted traffic now, boss. It's dense. He was clearly preparing for weeks. We're scrubbing every communication against known rival family encryption keys, Moretti primarily, and the West Coast Consortium." "Stop," Vince ordered, holding up a hand. The room fell into absolute silence. "Arthur isn't selling us out to a rival. He is trying to create a vacuum. He wants to be the last man standing, claiming the fractured empire. Look for cash flow transfers, not communication with rival bosses. He was trying to drain the coffers and flee." A grim realization settled over Silas. "We checked the accounts 3 hours ago, boss. Everything appeared normal." Vince leaned over the map, the light casting hard shadows on his features. He wouldn't drain the operating accounts. He would access the offshore liquidity reserves, the ones tied to the Panama shell companies. Only 3 people knew those passcodes: me, Arthur, and the Foundation lawyer. He tapped the screen. "I want immediate, hard access requests made to those Panama accounts. Check for recent large-scale liquidations. If he pulled the funds, that confirms the motive: pure greed and political ambition, not a rival alliance." As Silas dispatched the complex hacking request, Vince addressed the issue of the immediate, lingering danger: the surviving operatives from the Corinthian room. "The 2 at the restaurant, the woman and the one I hit with the tray," Vince stated, referring to the operatives who had survived the initial brutal and silent clearing of the room. "They are trained. They know they failed. They will attempt to retreat to a secure position and wait for new orders. Arthur will be providing those orders, or their immediate handler will." Vince activated a separate, secured phone line, the Marcus channel. "Marcus," Vince said, his voice flat and steady. "The Southport intercept is primary, but I need secondary data. The restaurant scene, who cleaned it? Was there an immediate handler for the 3 crews I engaged?" Marcus' voice, filtered through the satellite line, was gravelly. "We've done a preliminary sweep, boss. The local police are being stonewalled by the restaurant management, who are already ours. We pulled the bodies, cleaned the scene. The woman, the one near the window, she escaped the building through the main entrance during the stampede. The diner I hit with the tray was picked up by an unmarked sedan just 2 blocks away. A handler," Vince confirmed. "Not Arthur. Arthur is too far away to command that quickly. A local, loyal lieutenant to Arthur. Find the sedan, find the lieutenant." The complexity of the betrayal started to reveal itself. Arthur hadn't simply tried to kill Vince. He had planned a layered operation: immediate assassination, followed by a managed political transition. The hacking team, working remotely, reported back via encrypted chat on Silas' tablet. "Boss," Silas reported, his voice tight. Confirmation. Arthur executed 3 separate wire transfers from the Panama reserves starting yesterday morning. Total liquidity transfer, $800 million. Hes running with the foundation cash. The confirmation of the motive was a relief to Vince, strangely. Pure treason for money was easier to deal with than a sprawling rival war. It limited the field of players. Arthur underestimated my security posture and overestimated his own anonymity, Vince said, leaning back, the steel control never faltering. He knew my routine, yes, but he didn't know the depth of my surveillance on him. Vince looked at the 5 men. Our priority is not the money. The money is leverage. Our priority is Arthur's head on a platter before he reaches that yacht. If he escapes, this becomes a generational conflict. The climax of the plan began to solidify, focusing on the choke point near Southport, the marina where the yacht was scheduled to depart. Silas, you and 3 men establish a hardened perimeter 3 miles north of the Southport marina. I want the vehicle immobilized before it gets within visual range of the boat. No collateral damage. If the vehicle is disabled, Arthur will be forced to move on foot through the marshlands. That is where we engage. Vince paused, his eyes narrowing. And Chloe, the waitress. Her intel saved the entire enterprise. We owe her. Silas waited. In their world, owing could mean anything from a severed tongue to a secured life. She showed quiet moral courage. She is a risk-taker, but she acted with integrity, Vince stated. Find her current address. She needs to disappear. She needs a new identity, a secured fund in an offshore account, enough to live the rest of her life in quiet luxury. Send her a clear message. Protection, silence, and thanks. If she speaks a word of the Corinthian room, the protection vanishes. The orders were precise, transactional, and efficient, a testament to Vince's ability to manage extreme crisis without losing sight of the secondary variables. Vince turned to the remaining 2 operatives in the shipyard office. You 2 stay here. Monitor the Marcus channel for information on Arthur's local lieutenant. If we disable Arthur, the lieutenant will panic. I want that man found, interrogated, and eliminated by morning. We need to know who else Arthur brought into the fold. With the tactical deployment settled, Vince retrieved a heavy, specialized assault rifle from a secure wall panel. He checked the magazine, the motion smooth and practiced. This was not the Mont Blanc pen. This was the blunt instrument of ultimate authority. The chosen area was a stretch of highway, flanked by thick, impenetrable pine forest on one side and a rocky embankment leading down to the marsh on the other. It was an ideal bottleneck. We have confirmation on the vehicle, boss, Silas whispered, looking at the tablet. It's a black custom Cadillac Escalade armored plating, too heavy for a simple spike strip to stop instantly. Silas nodded, already communicating the change in tactics to the 3 men deployed ahead. The plan shifted from a violent roadside shootout to a controlled high-tech neutralization. Vince watched the infrared feed from the drone's eye, displayed on Silas's tablet. The Escalade, moving fast and confident, approached the zone. Activate, Vince commanded. A brief, silent pulse radiated outward. The drone, executing its programmed function, vanished back into the night sky. On the road, the headlights of the Escalade suddenly winked out. The armored vehicle, maintaining momentum, began to drift violently before grinding to a halt against the guardrail, steam issuing from the hood. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. This was the climax, the moment of confrontation, stripped of the pretense of high-end dining and corporate anonymity. This was the reckoning. Vince and Silas moved through the forest, weapons raised. They could see the dark shape of the vehicle. 2 figures emerged from the Cadillac. Not Arthur, but 2 hardened bodyguards carrying heavy automatic weapons. They were confused, scanning the roadside, expecting a physical attack, not a technological one. He is protected, boss, Silas muttered. He always was, Vince responded, his voice barely audible. Arthur is a coward. He'll be cowering in the back seat, or he's already attempting to escape the vehicle from the non-primary door. Vince motioned to the 3 men positioned down the road. They were to engage the 2 armed guards with non-lethal high-velocity rounds designed to incapacitate, not kill, ensuring Arthur remained trapped in the vehicle or forced to flee unarmed. The exchange was swift. Muted pops from suppressed rifles echoed slightly in the forest, followed by the heavy thuds of 2 large men collapsing onto the asphalt, their armor useless against the specialized rounds that targeted nerve centers and joints. Vince and Silas sprinted toward the paralyzed Escalade. The rear door on the passenger side was slightly ajar. Arthur had indeed attempted a panicked exit toward the marshlands, hoping the confusion of the ambush would provide him cover. Vince reached the car just as Arthur, 52, clean-cut and perpetually tense, was scrambling on his hands and knees on the gravel shoulder, shedding his bespoke overcoat in his frantic haste. Arthur didn't have a weapon. He had his briefcase, containing the digital keys to the stolen 800 million. "Arthur," Vince said, the single name cutting through the silent night like steel. Arthur froze, looking up. His face, prematurely graying at the temples, was contorted in a mask of pure terror. The affable, loyal facade was gone, replaced by naked, pathetic fear. "Vince, you were supposed to be dead. The team, they confirmed the placement," Arthur stammered, his words rushing out in a terrified torrent. "They confirmed the placement of the note, Arthur," Vince corrected, standing over him, the rifle held steady. "They didn't confirm the success of your operation. You forgot 5 years of self-imposed discipline. You forgot the necessity of absolute vigilance. You grew comfortable thinking I was just an executive." Arthur tried to leverage his position, shifting from fear to calculated pleading. "Vince, wait. This was a mistake, an opportunistic move. The funds are recoverable. We can spin this. We can say the Morettis attempted to destabilize us. I can still be useful to you." Vince lowered the rifle slightly, not as a sign of mercy, but as a deliberate act of contempt. He wanted Arthur to understand the finality of this moment. "Useful? You tried to kill the head of your own family, Arthur. You attempted to reduce my legacy to chaos and make yourself rich on the ashes. That is not opportunistic. That is existential treason." Arthur's eyes darted toward the marsh, the dense, dark reeds offering a false hope of concealment. He tightened his grip on the briefcase, his final asset. "You betrayed me, Arthur. You violated the fundamental currency of this life. Trust." Vince's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of decades of absolute power. "You knew my routine. You knew my isolation. You waited for the perfect moment, believing the cover identity was all I was. You forgot who built that cover." Arthur lunged then, not for escape, but a desperate final act of aggression. He hurled the briefcase at Vince's head, hoping to stun him and gain a crucial second. Vince didn't flinch. The briefcase struck his chest armor, clattering harmlessly to the ground, scattering encrypted files and digital currency drives across the gravel. As Arthur scrambled to follow the distraction, Vince delivered the final, definitive judgment. It was clean, quick, and silent. He did not use the rifle. Instead, he pulled a small suppressed sidearm from his hip, a specialized weapon designed for close-quarters work. The execution was immediate. The soft puff sound of the silenced shot was absorbed by the night air, ending Arthur's life instantly. Vince watched the former consigliere fall, the look of pathetic surprise frozen on his face. The entire team emerged from the darkness. Silas secured the briefcase and began the brutal, efficient cleanup. "Confirmation of death, boss." "Target neutralized," Silas reported. Vince holstered the weapon, his movements once again controlled, almost surgical. The cold, white rage had dissipated, replaced by the profound sense of necessary finality. Retrieve everything from the briefcase, the physical drives, the paper trails, the digital keys. Every piece of information must be contained and analyzed, Vince commanded, stepping away from the scene of the execution, his shoes tracking gravel. The organization had been shaken, but the root of the tremor had been severed. "He is being handled now, boss," one of the operatives confirmed. "He has confessed everything." Arthur offered him 10 million for the successful execution and cleanup. He named 5 other low-level informants Arthur had placed within logistics and accounting. Vince nodded, already integrating the new data. "Eliminate the lieutenant. Secure the 5 informants. We need details on where they diverted the cash flow while Arthur was liquidating the reserves. I want those funds recovered and those informants interrogated until they confirm all ties are severed. Then they are retired permanently." The purification was underway. It was ruthless, detailed, and utterly necessary. The betrayal had exposed vulnerabilities, but Vince's swift, brutal response ensured those vulnerabilities would never be exploited again. As dawn approached, casting a weak grey light over the industrial docks, Vince sat alone in the temporary command center. He had showered and changed into a fresh, standard dark suit, the veneer of the executive slowly being reapplied, but layered now over a freshly hardened core. Silas entered, holding the burner cell phone, the black satellite model used only for emergency calls. "Chloe's location is secured, boss. We transferred the requested funds, 10 million untraceable, to her new offshore account. We left a note with the travel documents. Gratitude and silence. Shall be on a plane to South America by noon, identity secured, and will never trouble us again." Vince took a moment, considering the waitress who had risked her life for a near stranger. Her courage, born of observation and morality, had inadvertently saved his entire kingdom. He acknowledged the transaction. "A debt repaid," Vince murmured. "Now the structure. Marcus needs to be informed that Arthur's entire wing of operations is now under his command. We will conduct a full company-wide audit of loyalty and assets for the next 3 weeks. Any hint of residual loyalty to Arthur, any misplaced scent is grounds for immediate termination." Vince stood up. The crisis, the immediate threat to his life and authority, was resolved. Arthur was dead, his funds were being recovered, and the organization was being brutally realigned. The seamless, flawless escape from the Corinthian room had transitioned directly into the flawless, lethal purge of the traitors. He looked out the dirty window at the rising sun illuminating the desolate docklands. The incident had cost him 5 years of carefully constructed anonymity, but it had reinforced the core truth of his existence. He was not a finance executive. He was a survivor, a strategist, and a king. The Maxwell Tower penthouse, the symbolic center of his power, could wait. For the next few weeks, command would be mobile and ruthless. The message had been delivered not just to the rival families who watched the chaos with opportunistic eyes, but to every ambitious lieutenant within his own ranks. Vincent Maxwell, the boss who appeared calm, was always watching, and those who shot at him would not only miss, but would find their immediate future reduced to ash. Vince picked up his Mont Blanc Meisterstück pen, twisting it once, then sheathing the microblade, returning it to its innocuous state. The executive was back, stronger, colder, and utterly secure in his reign. The hunt was over, and the empire, purified by blood and betrayal, stood firm. Arthur's greed had been vast, but his plan had been mathematically simple. Liquidate the offshore liquidity reserves, use the immediate chaos of Vince's presumed death to seize operational control, and vanish before the loyal core could rally. The retrieval of the 800 million was critical, not for the value itself, which was immense, but for the message it sent. The organization could not be bled dry. Silas, looking as though he hadn't slept in a week, pointed to a red cluster on the screen. The primary transfer was segmented into 10 smaller accounts across 4 different countries. Arthur was smart enough to know one massive withdrawal would flag. He used the 5 informants to route smaller, regular payments over the last month, priming the system for the massive liquidation yesterday. Vince traced the lines of the flowchart with a remote pointer. The 5 names. "We have them secured. 3 are already at a secondary holding facility. 2 low-level accounting managers were intercepted trying to board commercial flights this morning. They were scared, boss. They didn't even realize Arthur was using them as cannon fodder." Vince nodded. The low-level betrayals were always the most pathetic. They lacked the conviction or the strategic cunning of Arthur, who had spent decades cultivating a false sense of loyalty. The informants merely saw a chance to retire early. "We need details on every keystroke, every communication they had with Arthur. We don't just eliminate the infection, we map the entire vector of transmission," Vince instructed. "Start with the accountant, David. He handled the largest of the 5 subtransfers. His panic will yield the quickest results." The deep cleanse was now fully underway, a necessary, chilling process of surgical excision. Vince had to ensure that Arthur's ideological virus, the belief that the structure was weak enough to be seized, was eradicated entirely. The burner cell phone, which Vince had kept near him since leaving the Corinthian room, vibrated softly. It was Marcus, calling from his secure base near the city center. "Boss, we're seeing chatter." Marcus's voice was tight with alertness. "The Moretti family is making discreet inquiries. They're running surveillance near the docks and near the apartment buildings of 3 known Arthur associates. They know something happened, but they don't know what." Vince had anticipated this. The rival families, operating on the assumption that Vince was dead or severely weakened by an internal war, would immediately test the waters. They smelled blood in the water, but hadn't determined if the victim was a shark or a minnow. Do not engage them physically, Marcus. Let them waste resources chasing shadows, Vince ordered. But I want a message prepared. A visual confirmation that my authority is absolute and immediate. We use Arthur's lieutenant. The lieutenant, the man captured at the motel, was the final direct link to the assassination plot. He was the visible proof of Arthur's reach and failure. The lieutenant confessed to hiring the restaurant team's boss. He confirms Arthur told him the hit was a surgical decapitation, required for a necessary structural transition. The lieutenant believed he was doing the right thing for the future of the enterprise, under Arthur's guidance. Vince felt a cold wave of distaste. Arthur hadn't even shown the basic decency of lying about his intentions. He'd couched his treason in corporate jargon. Release the lieutenant's name and photograph to our internal security channels, Marcus. State clearly that he was a traitor, working under the direction of the late Arthur. Then confirm his immediate terminal consequence. Make the announcement public internally within the next 3 hours. I want everyone to understand the speed and finality of my response. The rival families would read the internal memo. The speed with which the organization identified, captured, and eliminated a high-ranking associate of the failed coup would serve as a declaration of war readiness. It was better than any physical display of force. While Marcus prepared the internal communication, Vince addressed the issue of the stolen funds and the captured accountant, David. He walked toward a separate, insulated room at the shipyard office where the interrogations were taking place. The accountant, David, a man in his late 30s whose hands were trembling, sat bolted to a chair. He was clean-cut, utterly unprepared for violence and clearly overwhelmed by the reality of his situation. "David," Vince said, entering the room and closing the heavy door. He didn't raise his voice. He sat opposite the accountant, radiating a focused, predatory calm. "Let's discuss the Shell Corporation transfers. Specifically, the transfer on the 3rd of October. 75 million moved through a Shell Corporation in the Cayman Islands, disguised as agricultural subsidies. Arthur needed that money liquid enough to move quickly. Where is it now?" David swallowed hard, sweat plastering his thinning hair to his forehead. I don't know where it is now, Vince. Arthur gave me the codes. He said it was for a high-level, confidential investment outside the usual channels. He promised me a 10% bonus if the transfer was smooth and silent. Arthur lied, Vince said simply. He picked up his Mont Blanc pen, the innocuous tool of his former life, and tapped it rhythmically on the metal table. He used you as a shield. He knew if this transfer was discovered, you would be the first person we looked at. Arthur was already halfway out the door. David broke. The revelation that Arthur had viewed him as expendable collateral was more devastating than the threat of violence. He said he had insurance. He promised me immunity. He said you were too complacent, Vince, that you wouldn't notice until it was too late. Complacency is a terminal diagnosis in our business, David. I prefer vigilance. Vince pressed him, not with threats of physical harm, but with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate audit. He dismantled David's belief structure piece by piece, focusing on the financial trail. Within 20 minutes, Vince had the location of the 75 million, temporarily held in a Swiss trust account, waiting for Arthur's final command to move to the yachts holding funds. The account is frozen now, Vince announced to Silas, emerging from the interrogation room. David provided the final access codes. The money is secured. The resolution of the financial crisis brought a new depth of understanding to the betrayal. Arthur had been planning a complete hostile takeover, intending to leave Vince dead, and the organization impoverished and politically vulnerable. It wasn't just murder. It was an attempt at corporate annihilation. Vince stood by the window, watching the movement on the docks. He had been awake for over 24 hours, oscillating between the sharp focus required of the finance executive and the lethal precision of the Mafia boss. The transition was complete, but the cost was profound. The cover identity, perfected since early 2018, was now irretrievably spoiled. He could no longer rely on anonymity. Every meal, every public appearance would now carry the weight of the Corinthian room. He thought briefly of Chloe. She was by now likely high above the Atlantic, heading toward a new quiet future. She represented a strange, unwelcome moral variable in his world. She had acted not for profit or loyalty or fear, but out of a simple, inexplicable sense of duty. Vince's repayment to her was absolute. A clean break secured freedom. Her existence was the only piece of the entire confrontation that was not stained by blood or greed. "Boss," Silas interrupted the heavy silence, "the tower is secure. Marcus has swept the penthouse 3 times. He's installed the new biometric locks. They're waiting for you. The Maxwell Tower penthouse, the ultimate stage of his power. It was time to return. Status: Arthur neutralized. Financial accounts secured. Internal threats: 5 informants. Lieutenant eliminated. Chloe safely displaced. Rival probing contained." The list was clean. The operation, though initiated by a near catastrophe, had been executed with perfect, ruthless competence. "Welcome back, Vince," Marcus said, his gravelly voice low. There was deference in Marcus' tone, reinforced by the events of the past night. Vince didn't acknowledge the greeting directly. He surveyed the security team. "They have been fully briefed on the new protocols." "Absolutely, boss. 2 men on the ground floor perimeter rotation, 2 men assigned exclusively to the penthouse-level lift access. Biometrics are live. No keycards, no codes, only retina and voice confirmation." Good. Security was no longer a formality. It was now an absolute operational necessity. They ascended in the private elevator, a polished steel and glass cage that took Vince 80 stories above the city. The penthouse was his sanctum, a monument to the success of his ruthless ambition. Stepping out onto the marble floor, the morning sun poured through the panoramic windows, illuminating the sleek, modernist design. The view was breathtaking, but Vince didn't look at the cityscape. He focused on the details: the unblemished surface of the executive desk, the silent servers running the organization's digital spine, the absence of any clutter or imperfection. He walked past the sprawling office space and into his private study. He ran his hand over the leather-bound volumes on the shelf, books on finance, history, and military strategy. These were the intellectual tools he used to build the cover, but also the ones that sharpened the mind of the man beneath the suit. He removed his suit jacket, folding it meticulously over the back of a chair. This small domestic gesture was the final shedding of the armor. He walked to the center of the room, standing completely still. This was the climax of his reclamation. The organization had seen him vulnerable. Now, they would see him rebuilt, stronger and more unyielding than before. Silas entered, holding a detailed briefing packet. "The immediate operational reorganization is complete. We've merged Arthur's assets into Marcus's command structure. This eliminates the possibility of factionalization. Marcus reports 100% compliance from the regional deputies." "Compliance is mandatory," Vince corrected, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "Loyalty must be earned, Silas. Compliance is merely the act of following orders when the threat of consequences is immediate. We need loyalty." "And how do we earn it now, boss?" Silas asked cautiously. Vince finally turned, his dark eyes penetrating. "By demonstrating the clarity of vision Arthur lacked." Arthur was focused on short-term gain and political seizure. "I am focused on generational survival. We will initiate the modernization plan, the one Arthur argued against, immediately. We show them that betrayal brings destruction, but fidelity brings unprecedented expansion." He walked to his desk and opened a hidden compartment. Inside lay the Mont Blanc Meisterstück pen, resting beside a secure communications device. He picked up the pen, feeling its familiar weight. It had been his weapon of last resort, a small token of the lie he lived. He placed the pen down and picked up the secure comms device, a heavy, military-grade satellite phone. This was the true instrument of his power. Initiate the modernization plan. Double the funding to the West Coast logistics arm. Send a clear message to the Moretti family, an anonymous package containing Arthur's headshot and a single word: contained. No more ambiguity. They need to know that the crisis is over, and that the Maxwell organization is unified and ready for war, should they choose it. Silas took down the instructions, the gravity of the commands etched onto his face. The cost of the purge was not just the physical elimination of traitors, it was the psychological burden of perpetual vigilance. "And Chloe," Vince added, his voice dropping slightly, "confirm her security status one last time. Make sure the transfer team used the utmost discretion. If she ever resurfaces, if her anonymity is ever compromised by our negligence, I will hold you personally responsible." "Understood, boss. She is gone. She is a ghost to the world, and we are ghosts to her." Vince nodded, satisfied. The debt was settled, the anomaly managed. He walked over to the immense floor-to-ceiling window, gazing down at the city he ruled. The incident at the Corinthian room had been a brutal, unexpected stress test. He had almost died over a steak dinner, alerted only by the quiet courage of a stranger, but the test had revealed the rot and allowed him to excise it completely. The finance executive was gone, replaced by a leader whose control was absolute and whose tolerance for error was zero. He had survived the betrayal, eliminated the traitors, recovered the assets, and established a new, harsher baseline for loyalty. The foundation of the Maxwell enterprise, shaken momentarily, was now reinforced with cold, unforgiving steel. The long night was over. Vince turned from the window, the sun glinting off the polished glass. He had nowhere to run, and nothing left to fear. The hunters were dead, and the empire stood firm, cold, and utterly secure. The reign of Vincent Maxwell had been reaffirmed, not through negotiation, but through decisive, flawless, and lethal action. Smash that like and subscribe.